Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Hates podcast, brought to you by Recap Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Army bugle calls have been around for hundreds of years. They were a long-standing tradition when George Washington led the troops fighting for our independence. Bugle calls are used for signal-specific occurrences in the daily routine on a military base, such as when to eat, when to gather together, and mail call. In Washington's day, there were many more bugle calls than is used today. Back then, bugles and drums were a critical tool used to give troops instructions on the battlefield. Today, around 25 distinctly different bugle calls are still used. Most of us wouldn't be able to name more than one or two, but I bet you'd recognize many of them if you heard them. Reveille, first call, to the colors, but there's one bugle call that everyone knows, taps. Taps is probably the youngest of all the bugle calls. It originated just after the 7 Days battles. There's one version of the story that tells the tale of a man named Robert Ellicum. When the call to arms was sounded, Ellicum had nothing to keep him from service. His house was in order. His only son was attending music school down south. His wife had relatives to look after her, so he enlisted in the Union Army of the Potomac. Ironically, the story also puts him at Harrison's Landing. During the night, Ellicum kept hearing a wounded soldier in the field across the river. He didn't know if the man was Union or Confederate, but he only knew the man was suffering, and he felt compelled to help. As Ellicum climbed into a boat and began rowing across the river, he considered briefly whether this was some sort of trap leading him into ambush. He dismissed the thought as he reached the other side. He crawled through the tall grass toward the sound of the dying man. When he found him, he was so covered in blood and dirt that Ellicum couldn't tell if he was Union or Confederate, nor did he care. He dragged the man to his boat and rowed him back to the safety of his camp. In the light of the dock, it was clear that the man was part of the Confederate Army, and that he had not survived the crossing. But that isn't what stunned Ellicum the most. The dead soldier lying before him was his own son, who he believed to be safely attending music school. He searched his son's pockets, and all he found was a scrap of paper and a few bars of music written on it. The following morning, Ellicum asked his superior officer if he could give his son a full military burial with a 21-gun salute and the full Army band to play the funeral dirge. Since his son was a Confederate soldier, his request was denied. But Ellicum was allowed to bury him, and while his superior rejected his request for a full band, he did allow him one musician. Ellicum chose a bugler and asked him to play the music he had found in his son's pocket, taps. Sweet story, if only it were true. There's no record of the Ellicums being in either army, and no one has ever found a gravestone for an Ellicum in the area. It's purely a romantic tale kept alive through the years by the media and the internet. In fact, its fabrication seems to have been invented by Robert Ripley himself for his 1949 television series, Believe It or Not. The documented history of TAPS is much more mundane. In 1862, Major General George McClellan led the Union Army of the Potomac toward Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederate States. To drive them back from this strategic city, General Robert E. Lee assembled the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and engaged in the 7 Days battles to drive the Union forces into retreat back down the James River. Now, thanks to some modern movies, many people think that Civil War battles consisted of a handful of poorly trained resistors hiding in the woods and taking potshots at opposing forces. In this conflict, both armies were made up of around 100,000 well-trained men. At the end of the skirmish, around 6,000 people were killed and over 30,000 were injured. After the battle, Union General Daniel Butterfield was staying at Harrison's Landing near Richmond. Harrison's Landing is 30 minutes southeast of Richmond. Berkeley Plantation stands on the site today. During his time there, the general decided that he didn't really like the existing lights-out bugle call. Even though he couldn't read music, he composed a new melody in his head. He worked with the regiment bugler, Oliver Norton, until the musician could play what Butterfield heard in his head. Butterfield ordered Norton to play his version of Extinguished Lights from then on. It quickly caught on throughout the other camps, both Union and Confederate. The men began calling it Go to Sleep. A few weeks later, Union Captain Tidball was presiding over a funeral for some of his fallen men. He was reluctant to use the traditional 21-gun salute because he feared that it would give their position away to the enemy. So he chose to use Extinguished Lights instead. This is the first recorded instance of the tune being played at a funeral. 9 months later, it was played at the funeral of Confederate Major General Stonewall Jackson. The melody wasn't officially recognized by the Army as TAPS until 1874. But by 1891, there was an Army regulation that mandated it should be played at all military funerals. Army Regulation 600-25 remains active today. An alternate version of TAPS is written to be played by two buglers. It's known as silver taps or echo taps. However, Army Regulation 220-90 clarifies that the, quote, official version of taps is played by a single bugle. Echo taps or silver taps is not authorized. Echo taps is not part of the Army tradition and should be considered improper use of bugler assets, end quote. Further down the James River, at its mouth, stands Fort Monroe. There's a chapel there, with a stained glass window commemorating the day Captain Tidball first ordered taps played at a military burial. Despite being surrounded by Confederate territory, Fort Monroe remained a Union fort for the duration of the war. The area now known as Hampton, Virginia, was first explored back in 1600 AD. It was immediately recognized as a strategic defensive point for the James River. The first fort was built on the land in 1609, and for over 400 years it remained an active military site until it was decommissioned in 2011. Through its long and storied history, Fort Monroe has been the site of many historical military achievements. But, of course, it has also had its dark times. A ship called the White Lion carried the first Africans to Virginia in 1619. While the 30 men were not specifically brought here as slaves, scholars mark this as the beginning of the slave trade in America. But this story isn't about that. This is about the numerous ghosts that have been reported on the grounds of Fort Monroe. Oddly, the legends you're about to hear don't come from any random blog or uncredited internet site, but the official website of the United States Army. The claims around Fort Monroe range from pretty vague to, holy shit. Objects seemingly moved, orbs, phantom voices, full-body apparitions, even people claiming to have been touched. Some say it's the ghost of Abraham Lincoln, although that's perhaps the least credible of the claims. I mean, why? Sure, Honest Abe did visit there once, but he wasn't attached to the place. He had no real ties to it other than the one visit. So why would he choose to haunt Fort Monroe in the afterlife, just to tap someone on the shoulder? It was more likely to be one of the other famous occupants, like Jefferson Davis. In early 1865, Richmond was overrun by Union troops. President Davis and his staff fled to Danville and then to North Carolina. A few days later, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant following the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. This technically marked the end of the Civil War. There was at least one last Confederate cabinet meeting on April 26, 1865, in Charlotte. Davis was arrested for treason shortly after this in Irwinville, Georgia. Due to his poor health, Davis was sent to Fort Monroe, where he stayed for 2 years. In 1867, several prominent citizens, both Northerners and Southerners, posted his bail, which amounted to what would be $1.5 million in today's money. The government did not pursue Jefferson Davis any further. His wife was given a house near the fort. Davis was allowed to walk along the ramparts in the evening, and his wife would stand vigil. Each night, she attempted to deduce if her husband was being well cared for. A ghostly apparition is sometimes seen walking those same ramparts. Many people believe it's the ghost of Jefferson Davis. At the same time this apparition is seen, the window of the house where his wife kept vigil is said to vibrate. At least 3 other residential houses are said to have ghosts wandering around them as well. One where the apparition is a very stern, angry man, seen glaring at the current tenant. One where a woman wearing a maroon dress was seen tending to a baby in a crib. And one is said to be the White Lady who was allegedly killed by her husband for having an affair and is seen walking around the base in a white nightgown. In one of the buildings, a little girl has been seen and heard calling for her lost cat. The cat's name is Greta. But perhaps the girl has been looking in the wrong place, because in a nearby office building, the workers have reported seeing the spectral image of a gray cat peeking at them from around the corner before it disappears. And then there's the Chamberlain Hotel, one of the hotels on the base for visitors. It's said to have at least 3 ghosts roaming its halls, including, some think, that of Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was stationed there in 1828 and proved to be a brilliant mathematician. However, he grew tired of the regimented military life. He wanted out. He tried on several occasions to get kicked out by showing up to assembly wearing nothing but his hat. About 150 miles north of Fort Monroe, on the border near Washington, D.C., is Fauquier County, Virginia. There's a house there known as the Rowland House. During the Civil War, the land was owned by Southern sympathizers. They built a secret room where they could provide assistance to wounded Confederate soldiers. One night, several years after the war, a group of women were having a little get-together in the house. At some point during the evening, the topic of the secret room was brought up, and they decided to go look for it. After searching high and low, they finally stumbled over a trapdoor hidden in one of the bedroom closets. They didn't find anything inside, but they said the space was large enough to accommodate a cot. Suddenly, out of nowhere, they heard the clear sound of a bugle call, so close that it must have been right there in the room with them. Although they couldn't see anyone, the tune the Phantom Bugler played was taps. To learn more about these stories, check out the Big Book of Virginia Ghost Stories by L.B. Taylor. Check out va.gov and bands.army.mil. This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran and was hosted and produced by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything Jeff's up to at adarkerworld.com, and you can find everything I'm up to at recapitproductions.com. You can find the Carolina Haints podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Or you can find every episode online at carolinahaints.libsyn.com. To learn more about this show and the upcoming Carolina Haints book, visit our website, carolinahaints.com. Don't forget to like our official Facebook page at facebook.com/carolinahaints. I'm on Instagram at Recapit Productions, and I'm also on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. If you haven't done so, subscribe to this show, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. You can reach me directly at recapitproductions@gmail.com. I love hearing from listeners of the show, so let's keep that feedback coming. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.